Yeah, I'm just going to paraphrase H.L. Mencken here, who once said, for every complex problem, there's a simple, intuitive solution that is wrong. And beware of people coming at you with extraordinarily simple solutions for extraordinary complex problems. And I think it's worth keeping that in mind. There's no such thing as a free lunch.
Hey, this is Mops and Mo's with Drew and Alex. Alex, who do we have today?
We got a pretty cool episode. We got 3 guests. Our first time doing more than one guest.
Menage a trois.
All researchers. We got Lieutenant Colonel Ben Hando. He's a physical therapist and clinical researcher for the Air Force. He recently served as the research flight commander at the Special Warfare Training Wing and is currently a research fellow with Kennell and Associates. He serves on a bunch of panels, Air Force and joint level. He's an orthopedic physical therapy specialist. We also have Dr. Sid Angadi. He's an assistant professor at the University of Virginia in the Department of Kinesiology and a fellow of the American College of Sports Medicine. By training, he's a cardiovascular physiologist. His research focuses on the use of exercise to improve outcomes in patients in a wide variety of cases, everything from patients with cancer undergoing chemotherapy to patients with heart disease or kidney disease. And finally, we have Dr. Kaysen Scott, who is a senior data scientist with NCCI. He's got a background working as a research and data analyst, both with the Air Force's Special Warfare Human Performance Squadron and with the Army's 1st Special Forces Group. And I'll hand it over to Drew to talk about the studies they did that got us interested in bringing them on.
Yeah, so the reason we had these guys come on really boils down to two papers that we talk about. The first one is entitled "The Use of Force Plate Vertical Jump Scans to Identify Special Warfare Trainees at Risk for Musculoskeletal Injury." And the second study is titled "Association Between Markerless Motion Capture Screenings and Musculoskeletal Injury Risk for Military Trainees." And what was interesting about both of these is that if you look into the research, it's one of the few times where they have objectively looked at products that are commercially available for the human performance space and done some really thorough investigation as to whether or not the products in question, in this case, force plates and markerless motion captures, whether or not those things are doing what they are saying that they are doing. So in each one of these studies, you're looking at, in the vertical jump study, there's over 800 subjects. And in the markerless motion capture study, there's over 1,500 subjects, which is an insane amount of people to be involved in a study. And if you're unfamiliar with the Air Force Special Warfare Training Wing down in San Antonio, this course that they looked at is a hyper-controlled 8-week program where these airmen are essentially preparing for INDOC, for Air Force Special Warfare. So you could probably not ask for a better environment to conduct this type of research on. We won't spend too long diving into the papers necessarily, because obviously that's what the episode is about. But I would encourage anybody that is interested to Google both of those titles. Again, it's the vertical jump study and the markerless motion capture study. The papers read very, very easily. It's not your traditional peer-reviewed kind of jargon. They're very easy reads, and the findings were interesting to say the least.
It started some fights for sure. Those of you who are in the LinkedIn tactical human performance space know that this was a little bit of a bloodbath when the force plate study came out. Lots of people on both sides with strong opinions.
And I don't think, I don't know, you might have your own opinion. I don't think we set out to do this to bash the companies and the products that were being researched, but I do think, and Sid dives into this in the interview, but I think it's important that instead of just going out and spending capital and sort of accruing products without really giving it a good blush with research, I think this approach, and the reason why we wanted to talk to these guys is because they did a really thorough job objectively of saying, is this worth it or not? And I think that's important because it's all too easy to sort of convince a commander or convince whoever's holding the purse strings to kind of buy the bright, shiny object. And it's interesting to see what happens when you actually subject that to some long-term research.
Yeah, I think you guys will like this one. It's pretty cool stuff.
Enjoy. Because I remember I texted Alex Or no, maybe I hit you up on LinkedIn when because you posted it and then just set fire to the internet and walked away.
Yeah, the first text I got was that I set up like a ring and threw some weapons in and then just walked away. It was not what I intended to do, but I don't know. I guess it was the right blend of industry / academia, but
Yeah. But I don't know. Sid might talk us off. Sid, are you okay with that? Are you ready to go for blood?
Well, the way I view it, I'm an academic, obviously, and I think sunlight is the best disinfectant. And as long as we are not editorializing, but we're talking about the data as they are and what's going on, it is what it is. And if it turns out that this is truly a non-functional product, then call a spade and just move on. The way I view it is that to not say things that are critical of these vendors is also sort of a disservice to the operators, the taxpayers, and everyone else. So we don't have to call them names, but at the same time, I think we can be explicit in what we found and go from there.
fair enough.
That brings a happy tear to my eye as a government employee. Are you guys familiar with H2F?
No, not
Okay.
really.
So I guess for Sid's clarity, so Alex works on the TRADOC side of the Army, and then I'm on the Force Comm side of the Army. But both of us are involved with this holistic health and fitness project that they have going on. It's similar to what you would have seen down at Special Warfare Prep in the sense that like the goal is to embed human performance in the conventional military. So Alex's background being active duty, I think you guys probably touched on that already. And then my background first as a strength and conditioning coach, and then now in the program director role on the special operations side, and then now with H2F. So like I said, seeing this and thinking back to some of the conversations I had on sort of the consumer end, it was I think to Sid's point, it was lovely to see somebody show the actual data.
Yeah, that's great. Well, where are you working now specifically, Drew?
So I'm at Fort Bragg.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm out in Whispering Pines, if you're familiar, right near Pinehurst. And then Alex is up at Fort Eustis. Sorry, I keep talking for you, Alex. It's my fault.
Yeah. I introduced myself like semi-sarcastically, but mostly honestly. At the headquarters of H2F, I am the unqualified person. I work with like several PhDs. Most people have like at least a master's degree. I've got a bachelor's in international relations. I was an intelligence officer for my whole active duty time and like stumbled my way into teaching the master fitness trainer course for the Army and found out that this stuff is really cool and I really like it. And so at the end of that 2-year assignment, I couldn't really stomach going back into skiffs and doing intel. So I'm working on a career pivot here into, I guess, holistic health and fitness, but more broadly human performance stuff.
Well, what he totally glossed over was that as part of that, he started the Instagram Mops and Mows, and it caught on like wildfire in H2F because H2F is only about a year old in the Army. So he has really become the mouthpiece for it, for better or for worse.
I try to make sure that people remember that I am not the official mouthpiece and all of that stuff is not my actual job. I do work sometimes, but
yeah,
exactly. It's where a lot of the coaches have ended up. I initially started it trying to like connect with soldiers mostly and get like basic human performance information to soldiers because I felt like that was something the Army wasn't doing terribly effectively. We're just kind of hurting ourselves a lot. So just trying to get those basic messages out. And I have a decent soldier following, but it seemed to have resonated much more with professionals in the space. Just naturally because they care about it more and they're more involved in it. So there's a solid following of like physical therapists, occupational therapists, dietitians, strength coaches, athletic trainers. So
Awesome.
But I'll circle back to you guys' work. And I suppose what led you to both of these studies? Like what inspired you guys to go after the idea of using tech as an injury prevention tool?
Well, I guess I'll start you have to look at what you have. So we stood up a human performance unit in special warfare in 2018. It started, and the operators there and the staff there started to stock the program with all kinds of equipment and tech, so they got a lot of wearable devices. They got ready bands to track sleep. They got Omega Wave to track readiness. They got a Dari in place. They got Sparta force plates in place. They got, what am I forgetting, Kason? They got Zephyr in place, from Zephyr to track load and to track these folks with heat injuries. And they did it all really fast. And, we have this, they created this preparatory course because, obviously you guys see this in the Army as well. We break these folks when we train them to become operators. So there's this whole thought, if we can beef up our human performance presence, and we can bring in all these experts like yourselves and sports docs and physical therapists and athletic trainers and strength and conditioning coaches, nutritionists, dietitians, all these folks, we can, train smarter and harder, all those things that all branches are trying to do. But I think the unique thing at special warfare is that we have this prep course where they come in for 8 weeks and we baseline all of these candidates right when they get there. So we collect all this data on them before they start their training. And then it's just this really good controlled environment with, a high degree of, I guess you could say, internal validity. So they all sleep in the same place, in this controlled temperature. They eat roughly the same thing. They're almost this kind of like homogenous population of, 20 to 26-year-old fit young men. And they're all exposed to very similar training. And the research flight was, I was asked to stand that up. And, when I got there, it was like they were collecting all this data and nobody really knew exactly what to do with it yet. And I mean, I don't say that disparagingly. It's a lot of data, and there was a lot of decisions being made on this data, like, oh, this guy got this score on this motion capture system. He has to go over here and train differently. And this guy scored this way on a force plate. And so, he needs to go train this way and do these exercises perhaps, or, he's at risk, or this person scored this on their Omega Wave, and we really didn't have any idea if any of this had any validity, if any of this was in fact measuring it, what it said it purported to. So it was just kind of the low hanging fruit, like, hey, we need to figure out if this stuff is giving us an ROI, return on our investment. And when the community kind of was like leaning forward and purchasing this stuff, that was part of the plan. That was one of the reasons that we set up a research organization, was to really, kind of investigate this stuff as we're collecting data. Sid has a good term for that. It's like, I think you could call it building the plane as you're flying it, Sid, which,
Yep.
But, sadly, as we've started to look at some of this stuff, like we've said, it just hasn't panned out, and it's probably shown that we've gotten like way out ahead of ourselves on some of these things. But I don't know if, and then Sid, maybe you can tell how we got connected with you, Sid, what you were doing.
Yeah, so we sort of connected because, as I indicated previously, I'm an academic. I'm a professor at the University of Virginia, but at the time I was consulting for Luke Air Force Base, and they were using the Dari at the time. And we started looking at it, and I remember thinking to myself, this seems odd, because to do these movements and claim these things is brave. And so I thought, well, okay, let's start to test some of these things out. And as it happened, one of my colleagues at Luke happened to be at a conference with Ben, and they started talking. And at the time, I was, I just said, let's just get approval, and let's see if this device even is reproducible. Forget about whether it can predict anything. Let's just try testing these things out. So my colleague Barry put me in touch with Ben. We started talking, and I said, hey, we've got these data, and I just don't see this device providing us with reproducible numbers. And I hear you've got a whole pile of people that are getting tested. I think there's some real synergy here because we can then see what's going on, and then we were off to the races. Really, it was just serendipity, but really, it just worked out.
Well, it sounds like we do have some pretty similar experiences since you're using the building the plane in flight phrase. That's that might be like an unofficial motto for where we all work, because there's, I think, just in the whole across the board, whether you're conventional or soft or whatever it is, there's a lot of we're not quite sure what this is supposed to be. We're going to hire people and throw them into a situation and tell them to make it better. And there's a lot to figure out in terms of like what actual best practices are, and like, do we have enough outcome data to even decide what a best practice is? And there are a lot of challenges to this, and everybody's got their own flavor to it. So it's really interesting to see how this whole space is evolving so quickly.
Yeah.
Do you guys find, because I mean, I've sort of always said this tongue in cheek, but it's a lot easier to buy something than it is to then test it and validate it. And I mean, these are just two examples of the devices that you guys were looking at, but have you seen, and especially Ben being involved on the military side, have you seen this happen more frequently than not, where things tend to just be purchased because it's the shiny object and there's not really that much work done after the fact to validate everything?
Yeah, well, I'm a physical therapist by training, so I came from the medical, I was a clinical researcher. And when you're dealing with healthcare and medicine, it's, I think sometimes there's a higher bar. I think coming into special warfare, into this almost, it is a line unit. It's just a different mentality. And, like you guys alluded to, the culture is a little bit different. It's, we have these folks are used to moving and making quick decisions. And I think that carries over into some of their human performance, into the human performance realm. So I think I have seen it, not to the extent that I've seen it where I currently work. And I don't think that approach is necessarily a bad thing. I think, the good thing about it is I think they've said, we are going to purchase these things, but before we implement widespread implementation, I think they did do their due diligence and say, hey, let's set up the means where we can test this stuff, and we can, good on them. They hired this robust research team, and they, gave me folks like Kaysen here, and epidemiologists and statisticians and researchers and exercise physiologists to see what this stuff is doing. And, they want to know the answers. So, but to answer your question, sure, it happens. I think it probably happens in every industry. I think injury prevention is a unique animal, though. I think it's this perfect, not to monopolize this, but it's this perfect mix of, it's this huge problem, and everybody recognizes it's a huge problem that hasn't been solved yet. And, it's causing so much problems, and we don't know exactly how to fix it. So it's just this like perfect situation where everybody's like so hungry for a solution that I think people start to reach a little bit.
Yeah, no, I think both of us see that. And I suppose for the benefit of the people that are actually listening to this, because I've got in front of me the two papers that you guys wrote, the first one being for the markerless motion capture device, and then the other one being for the force plate. Can you guys walk through, just at sort of a high level, the design, the methods, the results of each one of those? And I know that they're publicly accessible, and we'll make that known to everybody that kind of listens to this, but can we sort of walk through what both of these are going after and then dive into some of the findings?
Sure. Well, not to bore everyone, but these are both what you would call retrospective cohort studies.
Please bore everyone.
No, so I'll do a little bit, and then I'll let Kaysen and Sid correct all my mistakes, because I feel like I'm monopolizing this. But essentially, we take the first, if you think about like Van Meschen, he has this like this kind of approach that most people agree to with injury prevention. You establish incidence and prevalence rates, and then you identify causative factors, and then you go out there and you try to identify things that can prevent a condition, and then you implement it on a wide scale. So for us, the first thing we want to do is establish, just baseline incidence rates. And we've done a little bit of that, but The second part is really what both of these studies were, and that's just identifying factors that are related to injuries. So, are there factors that might help identify somebody that's likely to get injured? And so, we take a large cohort of people and we look at their baseline measures, whether it's a Dari score or whether it was the force plate Sparta score. And then we use some statistical techniques. We use logistic regression in both of these to identify factors that were shown to have an associate to determine if either of these instruments had an association with the likelihood of injury. So we did that in a univariate model, meaning that we looked at like each individual variable, like does the overall vulnerability score of the Dari, by itself, is that associated with injury? And then we did what's called a multivariable model, which is really the more rigorous and the more appropriate way to really draw conclusions. And that is, is it still related to injury when you factor in all these other factors like prior injury, like age, like BMI, fitness tests, and things like that. And so, the good thing about these multivariable models is that they can control for those other factors statistically when you ask this question. And so, it's really the way that these factors will interact with injury risk in real life. So we think it's a pretty rigorous way to try to answer this question, answer these questions. But that's the general. That we had the same approach in both studies. This kind of retrospective cohort study using logistic regression to see if either of these tools was associated with injury risk. Sid or Kaysen, what else do you think you could add to that?
What I was going to say is that there's multiple aspects and things to consider, because like Ben described, you run a logistic regression, you run it in a multivariate model, and gives you things like odds ratios. But from a clinical perspective, and I've been a clinical trialist now for over a decade, the other question becomes is that what is the clinical utility of these tests? What can they really, what additive information can they provide? And so we ran analyses like the receiver operating curve analyses. And what that really allows us to do is really question the sensitivity, or rather probe for the sensitivity and specificity of these tests. Because at the end of the day, what you really want is a test that doesn't have too many false positives, doesn't have too many false negatives, and has a high percentage of true negatives and true positives. And the way you probe that is by examining the sensitivity, specificity, and so on. And those are the figures that you see. And what we discovered in both of these analyses, whether it was the Dari or the Sparta score, was that you ended up getting numbers which effectively were not that different from a coin flip. And that is the worst form of prediction, to put it mildly. And so that was really the issue. And the big part of why we did that was because when you have these large sample-based studies, even tiny differences, you run into the risk of finding statistically significant outcomes. And it's got nothing to do with the fact that something actually works, but it's rather because just the law of big numbers. When you have a large enough sample, things start popping up as statistically significant that are completely clinically irrelevant. And so that really allowed us to ask the question, well, we're finding the things that we're finding, but do these clinically matter? Do they change decision-making? Will they change the approach to managing the patient or the individual? And turns out the answer is not really.
I think to echo something that you guys discussed in the papers, but you haven't said here quite yet, is, and this goes back to Ben's point about like multivariate analysis, is it's only valuable if it's additive in some way. So if you start to control for all the information you already are going to have access to anyway, like their PT scores, like their body weight, like their age, like all that stuff that we can make decisions on without collecting any additional information, that's what gets you closer to a decision of whether it's clinically relevant, I think. Because if we can come up with a pretty good protocol for what your needs are, just based on your 1.5 mile run time and your body mass index and your injury history, well, we already had those things. And so like finding out how much it adds is important.
And they're inexpensive.
Do you guys find, so I think we see this a lot in human performance where, again, we talked about the bright, shiny object and it's very easy to sell and be sold. But outside of this space, I mean, I can't imagine in sort of in a medical model, you would see this type of thing. I could be wrong, but I would imagine a lot of this happens before the fact, before the sort of client vendor relationship. Am I off there, or do you guys think this is sort of specific to this industry?
I can sort of address that, but Ben, feel free to jump in
No,
as
go ahead, Sid.
well. But having been in the medical space, I can tell you it's really hard to make false claims out there because things are extraordinarily tightly regulated, especially in certain areas. And what I mean by that is, so by training, I'm a cardiovascular physiologist, done a lot of work in risk prediction in heart disease, heart failure, and end-stage renal disease. And you have to be very careful with how you describe the tests you perform and what you can or cannot derive from them. The FDA gets involved really quickly if you start making, problematic statements. But on the other hand, what I have definitely observed is in this space, there's a lot of flash, but not a lot of substance behind it. A lot of due diligence that would need to be done. I mean, let's just think about simple stuff that we do in the cardiovascular space, for instance, like the Framingham risk score. That is the product of decades of research, decades. And that model is used, frequently, almost every day and for risk stratification in patients. But then you look at this space and you see these people making incredible claims like, it's a vital sign for movement. Call something a vital sign, that there's got to be some heft behind it. And so what I've definitely seen is that there's a lot of stuff that is said which maybe does not have as rigorous a background as it would be as compared to what happens in medicine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that brings up something I noted when I was going through this, and something I've encountered a lot as, again, being on sort of the consumer end of this is, and I think both of these products do this, but it's proprietary algorithms versus sort of generic algorithms. And I think we've all seen, we don't need to name names, but just about every wearable I can think of and every device I can think of sort of sells the practitioner on this proprietary black box metric, call it a stress score or a wellness score or a daily this or that. And I think we've all seen at the level of the athlete, behaviors change when they see those things. And then when you tease the product and ask what goes into these algorithms, a lot of the times they won't tell you. So did you guys find that, I suppose the question here was a bigger issue that you guys found, the idea that these proprietary algorithms were giving off something that wasn't true? Or was it the underlying mechanism of the thing itself, if that makes sense?
Well, I want to say something about that, and then I want Kason to comment on this. But yeah, I mean, well, first off, they have, the first baseline thing is you have to even show that you have any association with injury risk. You know what I mean? That's like, and that's a very low bar to clear that they haven't even cleared yet. But then, after you finish that, you do need some sort of, some causative factor that you can address. I mean, that's the idea, right? That this is going to be a modifiable risk factor that you can go in there and train to, where, and so Kason, maybe you can, we did try to crack the code a little bit on the Sparta, the force plate study that we did. Kason, maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So, as we kind of, and I guess I should say we did quite a bit of work behind the scenes in really giving this data like the best chance to be worth something. So with the Dari study, we spent a lot of time doing like really high dimensional analyses of some of the data, using principal component analysis and different machine learning algorithms, like really trying, like giving it a shot, really trying to detect some signal in the injury data, but had no luck. But I guess specifically with the when we start looking into the Sparta data, that was a bit more straightforward to kind of tease apart. So anyone could do this really. If you just start plotting out the data and look at the relationship between the Sparta score and just your jump height and your body weight, you'll quickly see that the majority of the score is just your jump height for the Sparta score. If you look at the MSK Health score, which is their injury risk score, that's over half. So that's getting close. Like 60% of that score is simply your vertical jump height and your body weight. And so that was really interesting because we actually observed a negative relationship between jump height and injury risk. So it's kind of counterintuitive.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Yeah, it came about because of just a random conversation we had one day. But Kaysen, you can tell the story.
That was one of the more surprising findings in the paper. Like the mile and a half run time correlation with injury, not that surprising. Some of the muscular endurance stuff, not that surprising. I was surprised to see that jump height was not predictive, or inversely.
Yeah, well, and this is like something that we were quite concerned about because so basically that model. So like if you think of the MSK Health score as a model for getting injured, it's telling us that the higher you jump, the more likely you are to get injured. And so just think about like if you take any guy and put him on a jump scan, and if he's banged up and he jumps a lower height for that particular day, the machine's actually going to tell him that he's less likely to get injured and like, hey, like you're good to go. And so that's something we got concerned about pretty quickly. And that like, not only are you giving like Sid mentioned, like random advice, like a coin flip, but this is actually detrimental. Like this is bad advice. This is like telling them to figure it out on their own is probably more helpful than the advice you would be giving them based on this number. And then to verify it, we took everyone in the gym and did a little study where took 12 guys, did a series of jumps, and then did a series of jumps where you sandbag the effort. So try to jump roughly half as high. And sure enough, all of us, our injury risk score came way down. And so we became much less likely to get injured by just sandbagging our jumping attempt. And so, it's just like kind of ridiculous that.
I mean, that's because everybody sort of knows that previous injury is indicative of future injury. So I'm thinking like if I have a guy, maybe this is an extreme example, but if a guy comes in with a cast on his leg and can't jump as high and is being told that he's less likely to get injured while he's actually injured, if we just blindly follow what's on the screen, that's probably not the best situation.
No.
Man.
Yeah.
No, and
It's not.
basically
And
exposes the fact that it's a score that's fairly easy to game. And that's the danger with having these black box systems where you don't know all the inputs that are going into your model. And then when you start teasing these things apart and you recognize that, the downside of this is someone that is, unfit and should not be, say, deployed or sent somewhere. If they just bag their effort and get a better score, you could make a potentially dangerous decision about them based on that. And that's problematic.
Did you guys find, just because of the duration of this study, did you guys find or did you see where the athletes realized the game, so to speak, and were able to bag it, or did you guys keep that totally hidden from them?
we kept it hidden we didn't keep it hidden, but we didn't see that, we had there's a ton of subjects in both these studies. In the Dari one, we had over 1,500 subjects, and in the force plate one, we had over 800 subjects. and these folks are taking their scores, at baseline when they come in, and then they take them again at the end. And in the case of the force plate one, they would take them again mid, and then right before they would leave. So we would go there for a lot for baseline testing to watch the testing, but we didn't have the kind of close relationship with the students that a lot of the coaches did. A lot of our coaches did find value in both some of these tests that they did. Talking to them though, it's interesting. It's I don't know if it's ever just just the scores. It's the scores combined with a lot of their expertise and working individually. They'll have anecdotes of working individually with the trainee that they'll find something useful from it. But just one thing, just before we get off that last topic, injury, the thing that gets me sometimes about some of these companies is just almost the things that we're talking about, like, return to play after an injury. There is, the research is littered with failed studies looking at this. These are really hard questions to answer. Just return to sport. If you just go on PubMed and look at, how do you return somebody to sport after an ACL tear? Even that, like that specific question, nobody's really cracked the code on that. There's, all kinds of varying opinions, and predicting injuries. My gosh, that's even harder. There's just been 30 years of research into this. It's really complicated. And, there's some people that think that we should just stop trying to predict injury altogether. It's a fool's game. Let's find out maybe what prevents injury, and let's give everyone that intervention. And along the way, we're going to probably improve performance as well, but I don't know where I fall on it. So, I'm still agnostic, but I just think when you think about it in those terms, then you think that, man, some of these companies that haven't really paid any kind of dues, so to speak, in terms of research or data, come in and they're just like ready to implement and have these things used on a mass scale throughout the Department of Defense, and they're lobbying Congress, and they're in the NDAA, and it's really remarkable.
Your comment about the coaches gets after something I'm curious about, and there's something I say often because I think it deserves to be addressed, which is that data itself doesn't do anything. Data is something people can make decisions based off of. And I don't think a takeaway from this is necessarily that these tools don't have value, right? Force plates have been around for a long time, and they produce data that people can make decisions with. But it's the case that just like a single algorithm can interpret a single data point and make all the decisions you need, that I think is astonishingly aggressive, right?
Yeah.
These tools do have use cases, and like people with the right expertise can make decisions on them, but that's tough because we don't have enough of those people to just like implement these solutions everywhere. And our leaders are certainly seeking after, for good reason, really simple solutions. And you kind of addressed at the end of that that there just might not be a very simple single factor answer to this question.
Yeah, I'm just going to paraphrase H.L. Mencken here, who once said, for every complex problem, there's a simple, intuitive solution that is wrong. And beware of people coming at you with extraordinarily simple solutions for extraordinary complex problems. And I think it's worth keeping that in mind. There's no such thing as a free lunch.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think too, like I've seen this, my whole career has been with military human performance, but I have seen this as well in the sort of collegiate professional space. There's this constant push for mechanizing the human element of things. And I think in the military, it's even more so because leaders at sort of all levels are so used to dealing with the machine aspect of going to war, tanks, jets, vehicles, checklist, XYZ is taken care of, we're good to go. And I've seen that on the human element as we've built out these embedded performance teams, because they want the easy solution. And generally it is sold off the back of some wearable or some device that presents charts and graphs that look a lot like what you might get when you're doing maintenance on a Humvee. And I think we have tried so hard. I really don't know why that is. I think that the whole idea behind human performance, you can go back and forth between the biopsychosocial piece versus the traditional mechanistic piece. And I think a lot of these devices and platforms and software live in this space of fantasizing about the human element as very containable and very 1 + 1 = 2. And everybody coming from sort of a physiology background or a medical background realizes that it's a systems approach, and you can never capture that with a single algorithm or a single movement. That's not really a question. It's more of a thought that I throw out to you guys, because we've seen this happen time and time again, where leaders far removed from the training space make decisions mechanistically, whereas those of us that are down in the trenches, so to speak, have to deal with the human element. And if you aren't aware of the fact that, to Alex's point, data just tells a story, it doesn't make a decision, and you're sort of doing an injustice. That's me off my soapbox.
No, well said. I think that's really interesting. I've never thought of it like that, but I think that's a great comment. I like how you said about maybe it's appealing to folks looking at this from a mechanical point of view, or like a maintenance report. I like that. I mean, I think there's probably a lot of truth in it.
Working with the Air Force and now with the Army, I mean, and this is no fault to any of the leaders necessarily, but when they're presented so much information about everything under their purview, they will literally tell you, we want red, yellow, and green. Like, we want the human element contained in red, yellow, green. And I think that there's goodness in that from sort of a briefing standpoint. But then when you go to actually try to do that, like, you know, if we use a jump platform as an example, you could easily have a bunch of guys jump and red, yellow, and green the whole thing, and your reds go and do this, your yellows do that. But I think, to sort of Ben's point about injury prediction and what does that look like, I don't think we've even gotten close to cracking the nut, in so long as we continue to think of human beings as Humvees or jets, or, you know, enter your vehicle of choice.
Yeah. And this is just a feedback. I want to, you know, the thing that struck me when we were doing, you know, when I got there and we were collecting all this data is just, and I don't know if you all feel this in your roles, but it's just the time that it takes to do this, you know. I mean, not to get Pollyannish, but, you know, the great thing that, like, most people think the thing that makes the U.S. military like the #1 fighting force in the history of the planet is our training. I mean, our training is so important. You know, that's what everyone says about, you know, pilot training, for example. You know, it's not necessarily our technology, although that's part of it. And then when you take all this stuff and you, like, take these folks out of training to do all this stuff, like, you know, to take all these measurements, I mean, man, you better be sure that it's it's worth it, you know, because they're going to need that training when they get downrange. And it's just a solemn responsibility. I think it's sometimes I worry that we lose track of that when we're spending all this time playing with gadgets, you know.
We've talked before here about the fact that service members are sometimes treated like guinea pigs, because they're a great population to do research on or to try out your new protocol on. And there's offices across the DoD trying to crack the nut on a variety of problems. So service members end up taking like 30 questionnaires, and they're not sure what each of these questionnaires are for, and they're not sure who's making decisions with it or why and how it's supposed to help them at the end of the day. And you just get survey fatigue or assessment fatigue. And I think they're, like you said, about the solemn responsibility. I think we need to do a better job triaging what gets blasted out to service members everywhere when we aren't quite sure the validity of the tool, whether it's a device tool or just a survey tool or whatever it is. Like, I do think there's a serious responsibility to make sure we're not just throwing things at service members and then finding out later that we kind of wasted their time.
Yeah, well, I think it's a problem everywhere. Like Sid, you've talked about that. This is happening in collegiate sports as well, right, Sid?
Yep, pretty much. Well, I mean, it's the human performance side, right? And especially it's the elite human performance side, where people are trying to shave that extra second off, or marginally improve the lethality of an operator, and that's really where a lot of these vendors appear to operate in, where they make all these claims. And a lot of times, I think I have to say, what I was struck by is that it's clear that the armed forces and the DoD has fantastic tools at their disposal, like people like Ben and Kaysen. But what is also striking is how they're not often relied upon to provide expert insight prior to major decisions like this being made in terms of procurement or utilization. So, that's one of these things that we're going to have to figure out.
Well, it brings up another, I know I asked a variation of this question earlier, said to you specifically, but with your experience on the medical side, would you say that they've moved past that, or are they still hung up in that idea of move quick? And I know you touched on this a little bit, but I think it's worth repeating, this idea of, because that's a change in thinking, I think, for the military, where it's easy to move fast, spend money, buy the thing, and then, oh wait, maybe it's not the best idea for what we need.
Yeah, I have to say, as a cardiovascular physiologist, I can tell you that a big reason why we're so deliberate about the pace at which we move is because we have inadvertently done serious harm to people as a result. I can give you several examples. Just best example that jumps to my mind, many years ago, we knew that people that survived heart attacks got PVCs, premature ventricular contractions. And we knew that they're associated with increased risk of death. And so the chemical arrhythmia suppression trial, the CAST-1 trial, was designed because there was a drug that could just completely suppress the PVCs. One group got placebo, one group got the drug. People that got the drug got a large suppression of PVCs, like over 90% of the PVCs were suppressed, except they also died more because of the drug. And so what has really happened over the history is, the history of medicine is that we've realized that a lot of times bad decisions can be made because you're not thinking about the unknown unknowns. And which is why we're so deliberate about the hierarchy of evidence. You look at the epidemiological studies, which sort of are hypothesis generating, and then you test those hypotheses in randomized control trials, and then you see if something's real or not. And the flip side of that is that it takes a lot of time. In medicine, the typical pipeline time for a new therapeutic can be as long as 13 years on average, which is a long time. So I can see why there's a desperate, why people think like, that's just not going to work. We can't wait 13 years. But then, on the flip side, you then run into this issue where you start making bad decisions because you're working with not great information. And so, yeah, that's sort of like the both sides of it. The medical model works because it's incredibly rigorous and careful and thoughtful and deliberate. Even these mRNA vaccines that came out for COVID, they're built on the backbone of 20 years of research. Like the original papers on this were published in the mid-90s. But then it takes time. But I think that's something that people are going to have to realize is that human health is a complex system-wide phenomenon. And it's not just the physiology, it's, the sociocultural context and all kinds of things that come into play. And to crack the nut on these things means that you need to be careful, mindful of these things. And because quite often it's like navigating a minefield. And if you take shortcuts, that's when you start getting in trouble.
Yeah, two things came to mind as you talked, especially about the 13-year average. And there's not necessarily a question here, but just a thought. Like I almost wonder if the speed of technological advancement prevents or scares people away from taking that long. Because if we put everything through a 13-year pipeline, even a 2-year pipeline, by the time you came out the other end, I mean, I'm just thinking of, heart rate monitors as an example. The tech would be so far ahead of where you were 2 years ago. And then the other thing from a military specific standpoint is a lot of the key decision makers are only in a position of influence for 2 or 3 years at most. And so to have somebody think of investing in something that's going to pay dividends, several iterations down the road is sort of a hard pill, I think, for some people to swallow.
And that's a fair point. But, these things can't be hurried up. Unfortunately, if you think about heart rate monitors, right? The reason they work is because a couple of hundred years ago, a guy stuck one foot in a water bath, another extremity had an an electrode attached to it, and that's how he came up with the EKG. His name was Wilhelm Einthoven, and that's how EKGs began. And then, couple of 100 years later, people thought, oh, you know what? You could just stick a strap on the chest, which is 2 electrodes, which detects the R wave. And that's how the polar heart rate monitor works. So, a lot of this stuff that works actually has a long history of testing and evaluation that really goes in. A lot of times people think, oh, this product went through development so quickly, that's great. But think of all that went behind it, right? That preceded it, that allowed for that development to occur. And that's sort of the thing to keep in mind.
Well, that's relevant to this conversation too, because I think a lot of people get the idea that because of some recent marketing and things like that, that force plates themselves are new. And I think like this audience probably knows that that's not the case. There's a long precedent of using force plates for research purposes and things like that. It's just the holy grail injury prediction thing that's new. And that's what makes the conversation tough.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
this is not the question I have is it even possible to predict injury? Which, Ben, I know you sort of said you were agnostic on this, but people chase it so heavily because I think in some make-believe world where you are able to crack that code, that makes for a heck of a brief to somebody somewhere who's very powerful. Hey, have your people do these 3 things, and then I can tell you within 99% whether or not they'll get injured. I mean, is that even possible?
Yeah, I don't know. And I wouldn't venture to, there's people a lot smarter than me that, like I said, have dedicated their whole professional career to that. I do think it's worth sometimes us thinking about what it looks like at the end of this. Like if we do get to the point where we predict injury. I was at a conference recently and these guys had developed this, they had purported they had this machine learning algorithm to identify people that were likely to get a hamstring injury. And they said they had tested out on this the collegiate athlete population and of football players. And they said they could get us to the point where they were like 75% accurate of identifying who's going to suffer a hamstring injury, So I did ask them, I said, well, okay, so how do you use this? And they said, well, on game day, we could see who's going to get see who pops, who's at risk, and then maybe we could use that information. We'll use it how? Are you gonna take that and go up to the coach and say, hey, I don't know, don't start Matt Stafford today because he's got a 75% increased risk of pulling his hamstring? Maybe I don't know. I don't think I would. I think the ideal situation is, we say, hey, this person has, weak hip abductors. And if we strengthen their hip abductors, they're going to be much less likely to get injured. Or this person has a poor deadlift. So let's improve their deadlift and it's going to reduce their chances of suffering a lumbar spine injury. I think that's a more feasible goal. And I think that potentially a situation like that is within reach, using kind of these inference-based methods to identify these modifiable risk factors that you can then address. But, like I said, sadly, we're not there yet. But, those answering those types of questions, I don't think are as sexy as, this like quick, get this binary response, yes or no, like predicting the future kind of thing. I don't know. I'm interested in what you guys think, or Sid, what do you think? You think we're ever going to predict who's going to get injured?
One, I think it's a worthwhile pursuit to try and figure it out. 2, we're not close. 3, I don't know, but my guess is even if we get better at it than we are right now, my suspicion is that it's not going to look like what people think it looks like. And what I mean by that is that it's not going to say, and Ben sort of alluded to this too, it's not going to be like, yeah, this person's going to have that injury 3 days from now or something like that. Because at the end of the day, these things are probabilistic. All that they can really say is that this is the probability of X happening. And based on that, if you have a robust enough model, which has meaningful inputs that go into it, that genuinely do have a causal relationship to the disease process that you're studying, then you can think about modifying those risk factors. All right. I mean, think about the Framingham risk score in cardiovascular disease. You have age, you got age, sex, family history, things you can't change. All right. And then you got things like blood pressure, cholesterol levels and so on. Well, you can't change those. And so, we know the causal relationship between those things in cardiovascular disease. And so if you move the needle on that, you can make sure people have better, longer, healthier lives. And so my suspicion is, if we get to that point where we have a better understanding of the causal factors, if we get better at generating these models that then start producing meaningful probabilistic inputs, we'll get to the point where now we know what are those things that are actionable that we could potentially move the needle on and hopefully change the trajectory for the person.
Well, as you guys are talking, I almost wonder, and my background is in strength and conditioning, not in the medical space at all, but I almost wonder if you rephrase it as performance potential as opposed to injury prediction, because if I'm presented with a handful of data that doesn't necessarily say that this athlete's going to get injured 3 days from now, but instead says they're more likely to suffer, from peak performance because of these things, then I have tools that I can action on. And to the point about, I think of Matt Stafford, if you tell me he has a 75% chance of tearing his hamstring and I decide to bench him, well, all that does is move the target. And now maybe he's more likely to sprain his ankle as he stands up from the bench. I mean, like, how do you cage it? The injury you're predicting is only as good as the tool and the muscle and the part of the body that it's looking at. You can't do a full body scan and cover every single injury. I just picture Matt Stafford twisting his ankle as he stands up from the bench.
Well, and you bring up a good point, and that's, these are all these things, risk happens, as Sid alluded to, on a continuous scale, and it's probabilistic. And, we're trying to look at this as like a binary yes or no answer, which is, is it when they get to 75% likelihood, does that equal a yes? But, 74% is a no, so it's just a very complex question with it's going to require nuanced answers, I think.
There's a challenge from my standpoint, and I've run this question with leaders in like a few military organizations, all conventional sides, so it could be very different in the soft world. But the question of what are you actually going to do with this information if you had it and it was accurate? So we're talking about modifiable risk factors. There are a lot of modifiable risk factors that we have ready access to that we already know about, and we don't really change what we do because of those. And I think there's like something as low hanging as, if I look at the Army's doctrine for fitness, it says that the fitness test should serve as a guide for you and your commander to adjust your training based on your scores. But if I ask every soldier, has anybody ever looked at your score with you and said, hey, based on this is how we should adjust what you're doing? The number of them that's going to say that they're changing anything anyway is almost none. So we can add all the technology we want. If people were unwilling to modify what they do based on the modifiable risk factors we already know about, we have much more direct problems to go solve that are much more to do with leadership than injury prediction. And I think that's where a lot of this like cultural change conversation goes, because like, even if it worked perfectly, I'm not convinced they would change what they're doing because of it necessarily.
Well, I think a hard truth is that the data in the product exist to funnel information up. Like if I'm being sold a product as a practitioner, I'm thinking, how is this going to look good in a brief or something to a coach or a leader? To Alex's point, I don't think it exists so much to push information down to the level of the athlete to make the behavioral change, because otherwise we would have solved for sleep. We would have solved for poor scheduling in the military. We would have solved for all of these things because, like you said, the fruit is incredibly low hanging. Like it's so easy not so easy, but it's relatively easy to fix those things without the fancy tech and the spreadsheets and the charts and the graphs. Those exist to go up, I think.
And I would add that there's a serious issue just in the technology sector in general, not just sports tech, but so many companies are trying to convince people that machine learning and AI is magic, but it's not, one. But then also they're selling you a model of that approximates some like a conceptual model that you already kind of have in your head, right? So like with injuries, like you guys are smarter about injuries than I am, but you probably have an idea already in your mind about what contributes to your own risk for getting an injury if you go out for a jog right now. So how could just some special algorithm just turn that into a yes or no definitive answer? Like if you go back to like the first principles of an injury and then like, but we're jumping from that all the way to a yes no answer, and then these tech companies are trying to convince you, hey, like just believe it, like believe the answer. Machine learning is taking care of that, and they're not being held accountable for that jump in logic that's gigantic.
If it's, I was going to say, I wonder how the sales pitch changes if it becomes illegal to say machine learning and or the word algorithm.
Well, I think Kaysen nailed it. And all I was really just going to add is that when you think about these vendors and these companies that make these claims, I think there's something to be said for the incentive structure that allows for these things to happen, right? The biggest, boldest claim gets money from the VCs and so on and so forth. And that's how you end up with things like Theranos, for instance, right? And so that's part of the problem. And I think it's important to understand that I'm not saying that the people that work there are necessarily bad people, but there is an incentive structure in place that encourages these sorts of claims. Because without these claims, my guess is, if you just said and went to a fundraiser meeting and said, we have some ideas about injury prediction. We think we're going to apply these things. We don't know where it's going to go, but I think it's an important direction for us to be in. And in about 20 years, we'll crack the nut. Nobody's going to give you a penny. On the other hand, you come back and say something fairly outrageous, like, we got this figured out. We got this one number. It's going to predict the risk of X happening. And suddenly you got people, saying, just shut up and take my money. So that is sort of an issue there. Yeah.
I think we have this conversation at work all the time. I think we even had it today, but I think part of the hype around tactical strength and conditioning and tactical human performance is because of those incentive structures and just where the money is and where the decision makers are. And just like how many of these modifiable risk factors could we address with better K through 12 physical education and health education? But there's no incentive structure around that. And so it's actively decaying and getting worse when that is probably our single most effective intervention we could be taking to produce a population and therefore service members that were more resilient against injury. But
well, there is, and I mean, I don't know how much more time we have, but I'd be interested in both your and Drew's take on this. And this, so, and Kaysen articulated this really well to me one day. I think we were actually watching the folks do the force plate testing at Special Warfare. And, sometimes, we have a ton of coaches there, but one of the coaches was really enthusiastic about the force plate testing. And he was really expressing that to Kaysen and I. And when he left, Kaysen said to me, I think you said it's just, I don't say there's something sad about it, but just that, we're much more interested in what a squared away coach thinks of a candidate and how they're doing and all that insight that you all have and all your training. And, that's much more, I think, valuable to this organization than what this, I think you guys probably know where I'm going, what this black box algorithm is going to tell us. And sometimes I almost worry that the strength and conditioning field is, not that they're creating their own demise, but a little bit of that, just a tiny bit of that, just a bit of guys, I'm and gals, I'm much more interested in what you have to say than this machine. Kaysen, did I butcher that, or is that kind of the sentiment you were expressing?
Yeah, no, that's how I felt. Because the coach that we were chatting with, he's a really interesting guy and a smart guy. And I was like, man, I like data, but I'm not going to listen to this machine. I want to listen to this guy that's looked at athletes for 20 years and had boots on the ground trying to fix problems. on a person by person basis. I don't care if my score is 85 out of 100.
I mean, I will do my best not to get on a soapbox here, and Alex knows I'm very capable of it, especially from a strength and conditioning standpoint, talking about artificial intelligence, machine learning, and how it relates to the athlete. Like, I think, especially with the rollout of these programs in the military, we're starting to hopefully see a blank canvas of thought in terms of how we deal with athletes, how we train athletes, because for the first time, really, since I can think of in strength and conditioning, coaches are being exposed to a new population. It's not rinse and repeat from college football or basketball or some other sport where best practices sort of already exist and you sort of function within that. But I think now with the tactical space, at least what we the reason we put this podcast together in the first place and what we've sort of tried to tease out is that human element of it, because of a lack of resourcing, because of a lack of time for a lot of these coaches. They have to invest a lot more of themselves into getting to know the athletes that they're working with. It's a lot more of the soft skills because they can't hide behind fancy gyms or all of this tech, because sometimes the money is not even there. And when it is there, it's pretty easy to see through those programs and realize that the coach may in fact be hiding behind some of that and hasn't necessarily engaged with his population, and his compliance numbers might be down, or whatever metric you want to look at. But I do think it's interesting, especially as we look at apps and we look at wearables and we look at software, there is probably a future that we're headed towards where if coaches can't exist alongside some sort of tech that is providing them with information that they can action on, then they will ultimately get replaced by something that comes up with some workout that comes from your watch because you took this many steps. I think it's just inevitable that general pop goes in that direction, because it's a lot easier to buy a Fitbit than it is to commit to going outside and running 3 days a week, to Alex's point about K through 12. That's as far as I'll go on that soapbox, but it's definitely something that we're acutely aware of.
I was surprised that Drew didn't start cheering when Kaysen said first principles, because Drew was
I did in my head. I just didn't want to audibly do it because it makes editing hard afterwards.
Well, I appreciate that.
Yeah, of course. But we've kept you guys forever. I mean, we'll work towards a close here. One thing I would be interested in having you guys talk through is, having conducted these studies and ultimately, like we said at the beginning, come to the conclusion that it's about as good as a coin flip. When the intent is to, we won't say predict injury, but when the intent is to get ahead of injury, or at least provide practitioners with good decision-making tools, what did you take away from this that you might turn around and say, hey, if you do these things, you're probably making a better decision than if you just simply action on what's on the screen?
Well, I'll go first. Just that, when we looked at our data, we were able to identify a lot of things that contribute to injury risk in our population. And then I think the other thing we did is, just like I mentioned, that Van Mechelen model, where you first get a really good solid idea of what the type, just the descriptive epidemiology of your injury profile within your population. So I think we learned a lot about our population in doing these studies, the kinds of injuries that folks get, and then, things that are associated with it. It seems like, for us, that's kind of different. Folks, candidates with a lower BMI seem to be at a little bit of an increased risk for injury. Folks that do sit-ups at a poor rate tend to be at an increased risk. Folks that run faster seem to be protected from injury. All those things I think can help. But, the biggest thing with us, this isn't sexy at all, but it's true with almost every population you look at it, it's prior injury. If you've had a prior injury, when you look at these odds ratios, it's, 2 for any musculoskeletal injury, an odds ratio of, just over 3 for putting you at risk for a lower extremity injury. So, that gets to really screening your population and making sure that that these folks that have had prior injury, that they've fully recovered and that you've done everything to rehabilitate their injuries. And, that takes human capital, and it's not something that you can necessarily just administer en masse, but I think it's worth it, and I think it's that kind of like detailed, hard work that's is going to be what makes real differences.
Yeah, agreed. And there's some value to going back to basics. clearly. Looking at the fundamentals of something and looking at the classic tests that have been done, looking at the medical histories of these individuals, that'll tell us, one a day might come, in the foreseeable future where machine learning and AI might actually help predict injury risk when coupled with the human factors and so on. We're not there yet, but we might well get there. I'm not going to discount it completely.
Sure.
But I think, the most important lesson to really take away from all of this is that, when you're thinking about complex issues, just remember you need to do it carefully, systematically, deliberately. And when you don't do that is when you run into issues with your product or your endpoint. And you can use the best tools in the business in terms of machine learning and AI, but if the inputs into your model don't make sense, then your model's not going to make sense.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Well, thank you guys. First of all, I mean, this was a huge amount of work that you guys did with both of these studies, massive sample sizes, long duration. So thank you for doing that work. And then thank you for coming on and talking to us about it. We appreciate it.
Yeah, this was awesome.
Thanks for having us on your
My
show.
pleasure. Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Great.